The cold pressed against my wetsuit as I dropped through the water column, my depth gauge climbing past 900 meters. My diving gear felt reassuring against the alien darkness surrounding our team. Perth's continental shelf stretched below us, but what we were approaching went against everything I knew about deep ocean geology. James had positioned himself slightly ahead, his powerful frame cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. The beam from his diving light swept across the cliff face we'd been tracking for 3 weeks now. The sonar readings made no sense. Geometric patterns where there should only be natural rock formation. Structures that appeared too organized to be the result of geological processes. My breathing apparatus recycled each exhalation, the mechanical rhythm steady against my eardrums. David swam close to my left, constantly checking his instruments and monitoring our team's positions with the dedication that made him our safety anchor. Michael moved with careful precision to my right, his waterproof equipment bag secured against his chest, ready to document whatever we found. The depth gauge read 1050 meters when James's light beam struck something that made me stop swimming entirely. Carved directly into the underwater cliff face, an ornate stone door rose from the seafloor like a monument to some forgotten civilization. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Detailed reliefs of sea creatures wound around the door's perimeter in intricate patterns that seemed to move in our diving lights. Octopi with human-like expressions, intertwined with fish bearing too many eyes, while serpentine shapes twisted through kelp forests that couldn't possibly grow at this depth. Very old symbols covered every available surface between the creature depictions, their meanings lost to time, but clearly deliberate in their placement. The stone itself appeared untouched by the crushing pressure and mineral deposits that should have accumulated over centuries of deep ocean exposure. At the door's center, a figure dominated the entire composition. A woman carved in perfect detail, her face hidden beneath a flowing veil that the sculptor had made with impossible delicacy. She held a massive trident, its 3 prongs extending toward the door's upper corners. Something about her posture suggested both welcome and warning, as if she simultaneously invited approach and threatened destruction. I activated my communication system to reach David, who had moved closer to examine the door's foundation. "This isn't natural rock formation," his voice crackled through the water. "Someone built this thing." The door's size showed up as our lights lit it completely. Nearly 4 meters tall and at least 2 meters wide, it would have needed huge construction work to put at this depth. The engineering problems alone should have made such a project impossible for any known historical civilization. Michael's voice cut through our comm system with barely contained excitement. The symbol patterns matched no known writing system, but the artistic style suggests Mediterranean influence. Bronze Age, possibly earlier. James moved to the door's center, his light beam focused on the veiled woman's carved features. The stonework was so precise that shadows fell across her hidden face as if actual fabric concealed her identity. "How long would it take to get proper archaeological equipment down here?" James asked. "Weeks," Michael replied. "Maybe months for a full excavation setup." I approached the carved surface, my gloved hand extended toward the very old stone. The water around the door felt different somehow, warmer than it should be at this depth. My fingers traced the outline of one of the sea creatures, noting how the carving had sharp edges even after what should have been thousands of years of erosion. The door moved. A deep grinding sound vibrated through the water around us, mechanical and deliberate. The massive stone panel moved inward with the slow certainty of old machinery coming to life. David's light beam swept frantically across the door's edges as the gap widened, revealing something that broke every law of physics I understood. Air, not water, but actual breathable atmosphere filled the space beyond the door. The tunnel entrance glowed with a soft, unexplainable light that had no visible source. Our lights reached perhaps 20 meters into the passage before the walls curved out of sight. "That's impossible," I said, more to myself than to the team. David was already checking his depth readings, then checking them again. "Pressure differential should crush anything air-filled at this depth," he confirmed. "This can't be here." Michael swam closer to the opening, his equipment bag ready to document everything. The air inside the tunnel moved gently, as if moved by some hidden ventilation system. No bubbles escaped from the opening. No water rushed in to fill the void. The boundary between water and air held firm, creating a barrier that science couldn't explain. "We need to surface and plan a proper approach," David said. "Get the right equipment, establish safety protocols." James's response came immediately through our comm system. "We're already here. We've got full gear and 3 hours of air remaining." "This isn't standard diving protocol," David argued. "There's nothing standard about any of this," James replied. I found myself swimming closer to the tunnel entrance, drawn by something I couldn't name. My scientific training demanded caution, proper documentation, controlled exploration, but the pull I felt toward the opening operated on a deeper level than rational thought. The veiled woman's carved eyes seemed to track my movement, and the symbols surrounding her began to feel less like decoration and more like invitation. The water around the door's entrance moved differently, creating currents that shouldn't exist. My diving computer registered readings that made no sense. Temperature changes, magnetic problems, pressure changes that couldn't be measured. James made the decision for all of us. "We're going in." I followed James through the doorway, my body passing from freezing seawater into warm, humid air that shouldn't exist at this depth. The transition felt like stepping through an invisible membrane. One moment, I was breathing through my regulator. The next, I was pulling off my mask and filling my lungs with actual atmosphere. The air tasted strange, heavy with minerals and something else I couldn't identify, but it was definitely breathable. My fins found purchase on smooth stone flooring, carved from the same material as the door. Water dripped from my wetsuit as I moved deeper into the space, each step producing an echo that went on much longer than it should have. The sound made no sense. My breathing apparatus clicks bounced around as if we'd entered a cathedral. The cavern opened before us in impossible dimensions. My diving light swept across walls that curved upward into darkness, revealing a space easily 60 meters across. But the most remarkable feature wasn't the size, it was the light. Patches of bioluminescent fungi dotted the walls in irregular clusters, throwing everything in a weird blue-green glow that moved and pulsed like a living constellation. "This is incredible," Emily whispered behind me, her voice carrying with that same strange echo. She was already pulling her underwater camera from its housing, water streaming from the protective case. The fungal growth patterns suggest this environment has been stable for centuries. David emerged from the tunnel last, his depth gauge in his hand and confusion written across his face. He tapped the instrument several times, then held it up to the bioluminescent patches as if the light might explain the impossible readings. "Pressures showing normal atmospheric levels," he said, checking his backup gauge. "That's not possible at 1,100 meters depth." James had moved ahead while we were adjusting to the environment, his more powerful light showing the cavern's center. What he revealed there made me forget about pressure readings and impossible air pockets entirely. A statue rose from the cavern floor, the same veiled woman from the door, but here she towered above us at nearly 3 times human size. Every detail from the carved door had been recreated in perfect proportion. The flowing robes, the delicate hands, the massive trident. But where the door carving suggested invitation, this statue commanded absolute respect. The trident's 3 prongs stretched toward the cavern's ceiling, while its base touched the floor with authority that made the entire space feel like a temple. "Base camp here," James announced, gesturing to a relatively flat area near the tunnel entrance. He was already unpacking equipment from his waterproof bags, setting up the portable lights we'd brought for documentation. We'll establish a perimeter, document everything systematically. I left him to organize while my scientific curiosity pulled me toward the cave walls. The glowing fungi created just enough light to get around, but I needed my diving light to look at details. What I found carved into the rock made me call out to Michael. "These aren't natural formations," I said, running my hand along a series of perfectly cut shelves that had been carved directly into the stone. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each shelf sat level and smooth, designed to hold specific objects. And they weren't empty. Ceramic vessels lined several shelves, their surfaces decorated with the same detailed patterns we'd seen on the door. Some were small enough to hold in one hand, others large enough to store grain or water. The pottery showed no signs of wear, as if the cavern's environment had kept them in perfect condition. Next to the ceramics, bundles of what appeared to be textiles lay folded with careful precision. I touched one bundle gently, expecting old fabric to crumble at contact. Instead, the material felt flexible and well-preserved, dyed in colors that remained bright after what must have been centuries of storage. Michael joined me at the wall, his own light adding brightness to my discoveries. His expertise in old civilizations made him the natural choice to interpret what we were finding. "Intentional storage," he confirmed, examining the shelves' construction. This entire structure was built, not formed naturally. "Look at these passage openings." He pointed his light towards several smooth-cut tunnels that went off from the main cave. Each opening had been cut with precision tools, creating passages that disappeared into darkness beyond our light range. The engineering needed to create this complex at depth would have challenged modern construction methods, let alone very old ones. "The workmanship is consistent throughout," Michael continued, moving his light across the cavern walls. "Whoever built this place had advanced knowledge of underwater construction and pressure management. Emily had been taking pictures of everything since we arrived, but now she was focused entirely on the central statue. She circled it slowly, trying different angles with her camera. Each time she aimed the lens at the statue's veiled face, the camera's display flashed and went dark. "Equipment malfunction," she muttered, checking her camera settings. "The LCD keeps cutting out when I try to capture the face details." She tried again, positioning herself directly in front of the statue. The camera powered on normally, its display clear and bright, until she raised it toward the covered face. The screen immediately went blank, though the camera continued to function when aimed elsewhere. "Must be electromagnetic interference," David suggested, though he sounded uncertain. "Could be mineral deposits in the stone affecting sensitive electronics." I walked back toward the tunnel entrance, curious about our exit strategy. The massive door had sealed completely behind us, leaving no visible gap or opening mechanism. But as I got close to the solid stone barrier, that familiar grinding sound vibrated through the cavern floor. The door swung open smoothly, showing the underwater tunnel beyond. Our diving lights, left near the entrance, still glowed through the water-filled passage. The mechanical precision of the opening convinced me that whatever civilization built this place had intended people to come and go freely. "It responds to proximity," I called to the others. "We can leave whenever we need to." James looked up from arranging our equipment, relief visible on his face. The base camp was taking shape quickly. Portable lights created a bright circle near the entrance, and our emergency supplies were organized within easy reach. Having a secure exit removed the immediate pressure of time constraints. But standing in that impossible cavern, surrounded by evidence of an advanced civilization that shouldn't have existed, I realized time might be the least of our concerns. The air we were breathing, the pressure that should have crushed us, the technology that had preserved this place for centuries. None of it followed the rules of the world I knew. The statue watched over everything from the cavern's center, its veiled face holding secrets that Emily's camera refused to capture. My flashlight beam cut across the stone wall where I'd been working for the past hour, carefully looking at every carved surface in this section of the cavern. We'd been down here since yesterday, sleeping in turns near our makeshift base camp, while the glowing fungi gave us a constant, weird backdrop to our exploration. The others had spread out across the cavern's main chamber, each drawn to different areas of archaeological interest. The alcove almost got past me entirely. Hidden behind a natural curve in the wall, the rectangular opening had been carved with the same precision as everything else in this place, but positioned where shadows from the fungal light made it nearly invisible. My light showed shelving cut directly into the stone, but unlike the other storage areas we'd found, this one held something extraordinary. A book. Not scrolls or tablets, but an actual bound volume resting on the central shelf. The cover appeared to be made from some kind of treated hide, though the material looked nothing like any leather I'd ever seen. The binding had survived whatever centuries this place had been sealed, showing no signs of decay or moisture damage that should have destroyed organic materials long ago. I called out to the others, my voice bouncing through the cavern's vast space. "I need everyone over here." James looked up from where he'd been photographing the statue's base, while Emily approached from her position near the tunnel entrances. Michael had been cataloging pottery fragments on the opposite wall, and David emerged from checking our equipment near the entrance. They gathered around me as I carefully lifted the book from its resting place. I opened the cover with extreme caution, expecting old materials to crumble at my touch. Instead, the pages turned smoothly, their surfaces intact and somehow still flexible. What I saw on the first illustrated page made my stomach clench. The recognizable figure of the veiled woman dominated the center of the page, but here she was, shown accepting offerings from kneeling worshippers. Bundles of grain, livestock, precious metals, all laid before her in supplication. The artistic style matched what we'd seen carved throughout the cavern, but these images contained details that the stone reliefs had only hinted at. I turned the page, and the offerings changed. No longer grain and animals, but human figures kneeling before the woman. Men, women, children, all depicted with expressions of terror rather than worship. The woman's posture had moved subtly from benevolent acceptance to something darker, more demanding. The next pages made me want to drop the book entirely. The veiled woman was feeding. Her hands, previously shown in blessing gestures, now gripped struggling human figures. In one particularly graphic illustration, she held a man's head in her hands while blood streamed down her chin. The artistic detail was meticulous, showing every drop of crimson as it fell from her mouth. "Emily," I managed, my voice barely steady. "Can you read any of this text?" Emily had gone pale, but she leaned closer to examine the writing that surrounded each illustration. The script appeared to be carved into the pages, rather than written with ink, each symbol cut with the same precision we'd seen throughout the cavern. "It's similar to ancient Mediterranean scripts," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Linear A mixed with something older. I can make out some words." She paused, tracing one line with her finger. "This section seems to describe her as both savior and destroyer. Something about insatiable hunger." She moved to another page, looking at the text more carefully. Here it mentions eternal imprisonment. And this word keeps repeating. It might mean feeding or consumption. Michael had been looking at pottery scattered throughout this section while we worked with the book. He came over carrying several ceramic pieces, looking troubled. "The same themes are everywhere," he said, holding up a pottery shard decorated with painted figures. "This shows people being torn apart. This one depicts what looks like a feeding frenzy. Every piece I've found in this area continues the violent narrative." The truth hit me as I turned more pages. This wasn't just art or mythology. An entire civilization had lived in this cavern, writing down their experiences with whatever they'd met. The progression through the book showed their relationship with the veiled woman getting worse from worship to terror to something like complete horror. David's voice broke through our examination from near the entrance tunnel. "We've got equipment problems," he announced, holding up his depth gauge. "This is showing atmospheric pressure at sea level, then jumping to crush depth, then back again. None of these readings make sense." He moved to our radio equipment, adjusting dials and checking connections. "Surface contact keeps cutting out. I can get maybe 10 seconds of transmission before everything goes to static." James had been listening while continuing to document the statue with his camera, but now he came over to our group. "Whatever's causing the interference, we need to work around it. This discovery is too important to abandon because of technical difficulties." I found myself lowering my voice as I responded, though I couldn't explain why. The cavern carried sound clearly, but something about the book's contents made speaking at normal volume feel dangerous. "The malfunctions might not be coincidental," I said, gesturing toward the book's open pages. "This text suggests the entity they were worshipping had effects on their environment, their tools, their entire way of life." Emily had moved closer to the central statue while we talked, but she kept looking back at the book with obvious worry. Michael continued examining pottery fragments, but his movements had become more careful, more deliberate. Even James, usually confident and decisive, seemed to be checking the shadows more frequently. The bioluminescent fungi pulsed in their irregular patterns, casting moving shadows that made the illustrated figures appear to move slightly on the book's pages. I turned to another section, finding images that showed the cavern itself. The same chamber we occupied now, but filled with people cowering in corners, while the veiled woman moved among them. David finished checking our equipment and rejoined the group, but he positioned himself where he could watch both the tunnel entrance and the rest of the cavern simultaneously. "Radio contact is completely dead now," he reported. "Last transmission I got was garbled, but it sounded like our surface team was trying to warn us about something." I closed the book carefully, unable to look at more illustrations without better understanding what we were dealing with. Michael had gathered several pottery pieces that told the same story as the book. Transformation from worship to horror, feeding, consumption, and what appeared to be the complete destruction of whatever civilization had built this place. The artwork was consistent across all media, suggesting these weren't symbolic representations but documentary records. James approached the book with scientific interest, but even he handled it with obvious reluctance. "We need to document everything systematically," he said, though his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Whatever happened here, we're the first people to witness it in centuries." I found myself checking the tunnel entrance more frequently as we worked. The cavern's atmosphere felt different now, not just the strange air pressure and impossible environment, but something more subtle. The shadows seemed deeper, the fungal light more erratic, and every sound carried with undertones that hadn't been there before. Emily had stopped photographing entirely, keeping her camera packed away since discovering that it malfunctioned around the statue. Now she stood closer to our group, her usual enthusiasm replaced by watchful caution. The book remained open on the stone shelf where I'd left it, its pages displaying images of consumption and terror that seemed to grow more vivid the longer I looked at them. Whatever civilization had created these records, they'd left behind a warning that we were only beginning to understand. Emily had moved away from our group while we examined the book and pottery fragments, drawn to something on the cavern's far wall. Her flashlight beam swept back and forth across what I'd initially mistaken for natural rock coloring, but as I followed her light, I realized the wall held something far more deliberate. "This entire section is painted," she called out, her voice carrying a note of excitement mixed with apprehension. "It's massive." I left the alcove and crossed the cavern floor toward her position, my footsteps repeating in the strange acoustic space. The others followed, forming a loose line as Emily's light showed the true scope of what covered the wall before us. A mural stretched across the entire rock face, easily 20 meters wide and reaching from floor to ceiling. The pigments had kept their bright colors with impossible clarity, blues deeper than ocean water, reds like fresh blood, golds that caught our lights and seemed to glow with inner light. The preservation went against every rule of chemistry and time I understood. Emily positioned herself at the mural's left edge, where the painted story began with images of a coastal settlement. Her expertise in old visual narratives made her the natural choice to interpret what we were seeing, and she moved her light methodically across the first panels, while the rest of us waited. "It starts with a civilization under siege," she said, tracing the painted figures with her beam. "Wars, natural disasters, failed crops. Look at these faces." The artist captured genuine desperation. The painted people did look desperate. Men with thin features stared out at empty fishing nets, while women knelt among dried grain stalks. Children hid behind adults as enemy warriors came closer with raised weapons. The artistic skill was amazing, showing emotion and movement with techniques that belonged in Renaissance masterworks rather than very old cave paintings. Emily went to the next section, where the mood had changed completely. The same people who had been suffering now knelt in prayer, their faces turned upward toward painted waves that rose above their settlement. "They're calling for salvation," she continued, studying the body language and gestures depicted, praying to the sea itself for rescue from their troubles. The waves in this section seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, though I knew that was impossible. The artist had used shading and color changes to create an illusion of flowing water that my eyes saw as actual motion. When I looked straight at any painted wave, it stayed still, but the overall effect created a disturbing sense of life within the images. The next panels showed their prayers being answered. The veiled woman came up from painted ocean depths, her shape rising through layers of blue and green that suggested impossible depth. Here she appeared exactly as we'd seen her carved in stone, kind, mysterious, offering hope to the desperate people who reached toward her from their coastal settlement. "Early contact phase," Michael observed, studying the interaction between the woman and the painted civilization. "She's bringing them gifts." He was right. The following scenes showed the woman offering bundles of grain, schools of fish, protection from enemies. The people accepted these gifts with obvious gratitude, bowing before her, while their children played safely nearby. Their settlement expanded, their nets filled with abundant catches, their fields grew heavy with crops. Emily continued translating the visual narrative as we moved along the wall. For several meters, the story remained positive. The people prospered under the woman's protection, their population growing, their territory expanding along the painted coastline. Trade ships arrived at their harbors, and their warriors stood victorious over fallen enemies. But the tone began changing in subtle ways that made my skin crawl. The woman's posture changed first. Where she had initially appeared in blessing gestures, her hands now pointed with more authority, more demand. The people's expressions of gratitude became expressions of obligation. Children who had played freely now stood in organized lines before her. "The demands are escalating," Emily said, her voice growing quieter as she studied the progression. "Look here." They're not just offering food anymore. The painted scenes showed people bringing precious metals, artwork, clothing to lay before the woman. But even these offerings seemed not enough. Her painted form grew larger in each panel that followed, while the people appeared smaller, more frightened. Then came the first picture that made Emily step back from the wall entirely. A child knelt alone before the woman, while adults watched from a distance, their faces showing a mix of terror and resignation. The woman's hands reached toward the child in a way that could have been blessing. But the surrounding context suggested something far darker. Human sacrifice, Michael said, his archaeological expertise allowing him to interpret what Emily couldn't voice. She's demanding people now, starting with children. The progression continued with methodical horror. More children disappeared into the woman's embrace. The settlement's population clearly went down with each painted scene. Where dozens of people had once celebrated big harvests, only a handful remained, hiding in corners while the woman's figure took over the center of each panel. James had been photographing the mural sections we'd already examined, but now he lowered his camera and approached the final painted area. What we found there made everyone fall silent. The civilization had almost entirely vanished. Only a few painted figures remained, huddled against buildings while something monstrous took over the scene's center. The veiled woman had transformed, her face finally revealed beneath the flowing fabric. Rows of sharp teeth filled a mouth opened impossibly wide. Black eyes stared out from features that retained human shape but conveyed nothing human. Her hands had become claws. Her robes had torn away to reveal a body that combined woman and predator in ways that violated every natural law. The final panel showed her feeding on the last survivors, their painted blood still vibrant red after centuries of preservation. The artistic detail was careful and horrible. Every drop of crimson, every expression of agony, every torn piece of flesh rendered with the same care that had been given to the earlier scenes of prosperity. Emily had stopped translating entirely, standing motionless before the final images. David remained near our equipment, but his usual focus on safety protocols had changed to watching the mural with obvious worry. James continued photographing, but his movements had become mechanical, professional rather than enthusiastic. Michael examined the painted wall more closely, running his light along edges and corners. His archaeological training had taught him to look for continuations and connections that might not be immediately obvious. "There's more," he announced, moving toward the cavern's far corner where the mural appeared to end. "The painting continues around this wall section." He disappeared around the corner, his light showing a narrow passage that we hadn't noticed during our initial exploration. The painted story flowed from the main wall onto the passage walls, drawing the viewer deeper into the structure. I followed Michael into the passage, with the others close behind. The space was barely wide enough for two people, carved with the same precision as everything else we'd found. But here the walls pressed closer, making the painted figures seem more immediate, more threatening. The mural's final chapters continued along both walls of the passage, showing the complete destruction of the civilization that had welcomed the woman from the sea. Empty buildings, scattered bones, and blood-stained ground filled every painted surface. The woman herself appeared in the final scenes as something completely inhuman, a creature of appetite and destruction that bore only passing resemblance to the helpful figure who had first come up from the ocean depths. The passage ended at another door. This one was smaller than the entrance we'd used to reach the cavern, but it was carved with the same careful detail. The woman's image covered the door's surface, but here she was shown in her true shape, the monster from the mural's final panels. Her claws held struggling human figures, her impossible mouth opened wide in eternal hunger. This door felt different the moment I approached it. The air near its surface was noticeably colder, creating a temperature difference that shouldn't exist in the cavern's controlled environment. My breath came out in visible clouds when I breathed near the carved surface. The stone itself seemed to soak up light rather than reflect it. Our flashlight beams, which had lit up every other surface clearly, appeared weaker when aimed at this door. The carved details remained visible, but they seemed to come out of shadow rather than standing in relief. Emily had followed us into the passage, but she stopped several feet from the door, refusing to come closer. "Something's wrong with this one," she said, backing toward the main cavern. "It feels different." She was right. The entrance door had felt very old but neutral, responding to our presence with mechanical precision. This door carried a presence that made my primitive brain scream warnings about predators and danger. As I stood before the carved surface studying the monstrous figure shown in stone, I felt the same vibration that had come before the entrance door's opening. Deep in the rock, something was responding to our closeness. The grinding sound began low and distant, carried through stone rather than air. The door was beginning to move, responding to our presence just as the first one had, but this felt entirely different. Where the entrance had opened with neutral precision, this door's movement carried undertones of hunger and anticipation. I realized with growing dread that we had found the entity's true resting place, and our presence was waking up something that had been sealed away for very good reasons. The grinding got louder, stone sliding against stone with mechanical certainty that made my teeth ache. David jumped forward, pressing his hands against the door's surface as if his body weight could somehow reverse the process that had already started. His boots scraped against the carved stone as he pushed, muscles working against whatever force was moving the massive barrier. "It's not responding," he shouted over the noise, his voice tight with effort. "The mechanism won't stop." A thin line of bright white light cut through the growing gap where the door was pulling away from its frame. The light was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not the warm glow of the glowing fungi or the focused beam of our diving lights, but something that seemed to burn through the air itself. It hurt to look at directly, forcing me to squint as the gap got wider. My legs began moving without conscious direction, carrying me toward the opening while every rational thought screamed at me to run in the opposite direction. I tried to plant my feet, to resist whatever force was pulling me forward, but my body refused to obey. Each step brought me closer to the expanding line of light while my mind pulled back in horror. Emily was behind me somewhere, but her voice reached my ears as if from a great distance. "Sarah, what are you doing? Get away from there." I wanted to tell her that I wasn't choosing this movement, that something was making me walk forward against my will, but the words wouldn't form. The light grew brighter as the door continued opening, and I found myself 3 steps closer, then 5, then close enough to feel heat coming from the gap. Emily's scream cut through the cavern. I spun around to see her covered in the white light, her body rigid as electricity seemed to run through her. Her arms snapped straight, fingers extended, while her head tilted back at an angle that looked painful. The scream continued until her lungs emptied, then cut off suddenly as she collapsed to the stone floor. James appeared beside me, his hand grabbing my upper arm with enough force to leave bruises. "We need to get out of here now," he said, trying to drag me back toward the main cavern. But the pull was too strong. My feet slipped on the smooth stone as he pulled, but I couldn't break free from whatever was drawing me toward the light. Michael's voice rose above the grinding stone, panic clear in his tone. "Equipment failure across the board. Everything's shorting out." Sparks shot out from his camera equipment where he'd set it down near the passage entrance. The metal cases glowed cherry red for a moment, before the electronics inside began smoking. His diving computer's display blinked through random numbers. depth readings jumping from atmospheric pressure to crushing deep ocean levels and back again. The portable lights we'd set up throughout the cavern started blinking in chaotic patterns. The door was halfway open now, and through the blinding light, I caught a glimpse of movement in the space beyond. Something massive was rising from depths that shouldn't exist behind a door carved into solid rock. The shape was enormous, easily the size of a building, and its form matched the monstrous creature shown in the mural's final panels. Tentacles thick as tree trunks twisted in the brilliant light, while something that might have been a head rose above them with features too strange to process clearly. Behind us in the main cavern, a sharp, cracking sound carried over the mechanical grinding. I turned to see fractures spreading across the surface of the central statue, like a spiderweb of damage racing through stone. Pieces began falling away, revealing not hollow space or more carved rock, but something that looked wet in the fungal light. Organic tissue pulsed beneath the crumbling stone shell, red and raw, as if the statue had been nothing more than a shell. The cavern floor shook under my feet as David's emergency equipment activated without human input. His depth charges, meant for clearing rockfall during diving emergencies, armed themselves with electronic beeps that grew faster and more urgent. I watched his face go pale as he realized what was happening. Those aren't supposed to activate unless... The first explosion cut off his words. Then the second and third followed in rapid succession. The charges had been designed to break up small obstacles, but their detonation in the confined space created a thunderous roar that made my ears ring. Dust and rock fragments rained down from the ceiling, and new cracks appeared in the cavern walls. Seawater began trickling through those cracks, then flowing, then pouring as the enormous pressure outside found weak points in the stone. The trickles became streams, and the streams became torrents that splashed across the floor with increasing volume. James was still trying to pull me away from the door, but his grip suddenly loosened. I turned to see him rising off his feet, as if lifted by invisible hands, his expression changing from determination to shock to terror in the space of a heartbeat. Whatever force had taken hold of him was far stronger than human strength. His body flew backward through the air, striking the painted mural wall with a sickening impact that left him crumpled among the images of old destruction. The compulsion holding me finally broke as adrenaline flooded my system. I stumbled backward from the door, my legs suddenly my own again, and rushed toward Emily's motionless body. She was breathing but unconscious, her skin pale and clammy where the light had touched her. I grabbed her under the arms and started dragging her toward the passage that led to the main cavern. The bioluminescent fungi covering the walls had begun pulsing in rapid, chaotic rhythms. What had been a gentle, steady glow was now a frantic strobe that made it difficult to judge distances or see clearly. The very air seemed to vibrate with electromagnetic disturbance. The thing behind the door was emerging now, pushing through the opening with a sound like wet fabric tearing. I caught glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, something that defied geometric logic, composed of angles and curves that shouldn't fit together but somehow did. Its size was wrong for the space it occupied, appearing simultaneously vast and confined within the doorway's dimensions. I hauled Emily's dead weight across the stone floor, my diving boots slipping on surfaces now slick with incoming seawater. The sound of rushing water was growing louder, competing with the mechanical grinding and the terrible wet noises of the entity forcing its way through the door. The cavern that had seemed impossibly stable was coming apart around us, old engineering finally giving way to forces it was never designed to contain. Michael was shouting something from the main cavern, but his words were lost in the chaos of collapsing stone and electromagnetic interference. David had abandoned his attempts to stop the door mechanism and was gathering what remained of our undamaged equipment. James hadn't moved from where he'd struck the wall. The entity was almost through the doorway now, its impossible bulk filling the passage behind us as I dragged Emily toward what I hoped was safety. The brilliant light was dimming, not because the source was weakening, but because something enormous was blocking it from within. The water reached my knees as I pulled Emily across the slick stone floor, each step a fight against the rushing current that tried to knock us both down. The main cavern had turned into a death trap. Chunks of ceiling crashed into the rising flood, while the glowing fungi blinked wildly before going dark completely. I could barely see where I was going, relying on muscle memory to find where we'd left our diving equipment near the entrance. Emily's body was dead weight in my arms, her wetsuit slippery with seawater that made keeping my grip nearly impossible. My back hurt as I lifted her higher, trying to keep her head above the waterline that was climbing fast. The sound of the entity forcing its way through the passage behind us grew louder. Wet, tearing noises mixed with something like breathing, if breathing could shake the walls of an underground cavern. I couldn't see James anywhere in the chaos. The wall where he'd hit was hidden behind falling debris and rushing water. Michael's voice had gone silent, replaced by the noise of collapsing stone and the horrible sounds coming from the entity's emergence. The painted mural that had told the story of an old civilization's destruction was now being destroyed itself, chunks of painted rock breaking away and falling into the flood. My foot hit something solid beneath the water, our equipment pile, partially underwater, but still stuck where David had left it. I searched through the waterproof bags, my fingers numb from cold and adrenaline, looking for the emergency ascent devices we'd brought as standard safety equipment. The water level had reached my waist, and Emily's face was dangerously close to going under. The emergency ascent device felt normal in my hands. I'd practiced with these in training, but never imagined using one in conditions like this. My hands shook as I strapped the device around Emily's chest, the buckles fighting against the water pressure in my own panic. Behind us, something massive was moving through the main cavern. I didn't dare look back, but the movement of water told me the entity had fully come out of its prison. The old door that had held it for centuries was now nothing more than broken stone, and the thing that had once been worshipped as a helpful sea goddess was free to reclaim the ocean that had created it. I found my own emergency device and struggled into the straps while keeping Emily's head above water. The cavern's ceiling was coming apart in sections now, massive slabs of stone crashing into the flood with impacts that sent waves against the walls. The entrance tunnel was still visible, but barely, a black opening rapidly disappearing beneath the rising waterline. The entity's presence filled the cavern like a living nightmare. Through the murky water, I caught glimpses of tentacles thick as ship's cables moving through the space where we'd made our discoveries. The central statue had broken completely, revealing that the stone shell had been nothing more than a protective shell. What came out of the wreckage looked only a little like the carved woman we'd found. This was something far older, far more alien than any human interpretation could capture. I turned on Emily's ascent device first, watching the small CO2 cartridge trigger and begin inflating the vest. The device was designed to provide enough lift to pull an unconscious diver through hundreds of meters of water, but we were at impossible depth. Physics said the rapid ascent should kill us both through decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, or simple pressure shock. But staying here meant certain death, and the entity was moving closer. Emily's body jerked upward as the vest inflated, pulling her toward the cavern's ceiling. I triggered my own device and felt the violent yank as the emergency system turned on. The feeling was like being grabbed by a giant hand and pulled skyward through the churning water. We shot through the flooded cavern toward the entrance tunnel. My last clear view showing tentacles reaching after us with movements too quick for something so massive. The tunnel walls rushed past in a blur of stone and debris. Emergency lights from our abandoned equipment creating strobing flashes in the murky water. I held onto Emily's vest with both hands, hoping the ascent devices wouldn't separate us during the violent rise. The tunnel gave way to open ocean, and suddenly we were rocketing upward through crushing darkness. My diving computer, somehow still working, displayed numbers that made no sense. We were rising at speeds that should have torn us apart, covering hundreds of meters in seconds rather than the careful minutes required for safe decompression. The pressure changes should have been agony, but I felt nothing except the desperate need to reach the surface before my air supply ran out. Emily floated beside me in the emergency vest, her face pale but peaceful in the dim glow of my remaining dive light. I couldn't tell if she was breathing. The ascent devices were designed to bring unconscious divers to the surface quickly enough to save their lives, but not necessarily gently enough to prevent other injuries. All I could do was hold on and trust that the equipment would work as intended. The water grew lighter as we rose, and I realized we were approaching the surface far faster than seemed possible. My depth gauge showed readings that climbed in impossible increments: 800 meters, 600, 400, 200. At 50 meters depth, I could see the hull of our research vessel outlined against what looked like daylight filtering down through the water. We broke the surface with explosive force, both emergency vests rocketing us several feet into the air before we crashed back down into the swells. The research vessel, Deep Current, was exactly where we'd left it, anchored above the dive site with its crew maintaining position. I heard shouting from the deck as they spotted us in the water. The crew pulled us aboard with practiced efficiency, their faces showing the relief and confusion of people who'd been tracking a dive team that had been underwater far longer than their air supplies should have allowed. Emily was completely unconscious, her skin cold and pale, but she was breathing. The ship's medic took over her care immediately while I sat shivering on the deck, trying to process what had just happened. The next 3 days passed in a haze of medical checks and impossible explanations. Emily remained unconscious in the ship's medical bay while I underwent every test the crew's limited facilities could provide. My blood showed no signs of decompression sickness, no nitrogen bubbles, no indication that I'd been at crushing depth just hours before. The medic couldn't explain it, and neither could I. When Emily finally woke on the 3rd day, her first words were questions about where we were and why she felt so tired. She remembered entering the cavern, examining the painted murals, but nothing after that. The entire discovery, the book, the entity, the collapse, had been wiped from her memory as cleanly as if those hours had never happened. I tried to show her the photos we'd taken, but every piece of electronic equipment we'd brought down had been destroyed by electromagnetic interference. Cameras, computers, diving instruments, emergency beacons. Everything was broken beyond repair. The crew's surface equipment had registered massive electromagnetic problems during our dive, but they'd blamed it on unusual mineral deposits on the sea floor. The official investigation was brief and unsatisfying. James Rodriguez, Michael Chen, and David Thompson were listed as victims of an underwater landslide that had happened during routine exploration. Their bodies were never recovered, and the insurance companies eventually paid out their life policies to surviving family members. The dive site was marked as unstable and placed off limits to future expeditions.
2 weeks later, I returned to the coordinates with a new team and the best deep-sea equipment money could rent. I was certain we could relocate the entrance, document the discovery properly, maybe even determine what had happened to my colleagues. But when we reached the sea floor at precisely the same coordinates our GPS had recorded, we found nothing. Solid cliff face stretched in both directions, unbroken stone that showed no signs of carving, no trace of the decorated door that had opened to impossible depths. I spent 6 hours searching every meter of the area, convinced I'd made a navigation error, but the coordinates were exact. Where an old civilization had built their temple to a sea goddess, where we'd discovered evidence of worship turned to horror, where something had been imprisoned for centuries until we'd freed it. There was only natural rock that looked like it had never been disturbed. The new team's sonar readings showed solid stone extending deep into the cliff face, No hollow spaces, no chambers, no passages. According to every instrument we used, the cavern we'd explored had never existed, but I knew better. I returned to my position at the Maritime Research Institute and filed my report about equipment failure and underwater geological instability. Emily went back to her graduate studies with no memory of anything unusual about our expedition. The families of James, Michael, and David received death benefits and sympathy cards. And I started watching the news. Missing fishing vessels off the coast of Western Australia. A cargo ship that had lost radio contact for 12 hours before reappearing with half its crew suffering from severe psychological trauma. Recreational divers reporting encounters with something massive moving through deep water channels. Each story was explained away. Equipment failure, weather conditions, group hysteria brought on by nitrogen narcosis. But I recognized the patterns. Something old was free in the deep ocean, something that had once inspired worship before revealing its true nature to a civilization that had paid the ultimate price for their devotion. The entity that had been sealed away by people who understood its hunger had been released by people who thought they were making a discovery. I kept newspaper clippings in a file that grew thicker every month. Ships that vanished without distress signals, sonar contacts that appeared and disappeared from naval tracking stations, commercial fishing operations reporting dramatic drops in deep water catches, as if something was competing with them for the ocean's resources. Each incident was isolated, explained, forgotten by everyone except me. The thing we'd freed was out there, swimming through depths where human eyes would never see it, following old migration patterns or creating new ones. It had waited centuries for release, and now it had all the time in the world to reclaim an ocean that had once feared its presence. I watched the shipping reports every morning, checked maritime accident databases every evening, and wondered how long it would take before the disappearances became too frequent and too widespread to explain away. The entity had been patient before. It could afford to be patient again. But patience had its limits, and something that had once devoured an entire civilization wasn't likely to remain satisfied with fishing boats and cargo vessels forever.